Just going to add about how inappropriate it is to talk about the language of evil with Martin Luther King behind me, but you'll have to ignore it. As Lucy told you, I got to hold the physical copy of this book that I spent years working on for the first time yesterday because the managing director of my publishing company, Martin, who sat there, very kindly drove all the way from London so that I could see it. So if you saw me with tears of joy brandishing a book, that would be why. And it was incredibly special for me that the first time I got this book was at the European Speechwriter Network conference. I first came to this conference 12 years ago when I was a student, and in the acknowledgements it says, "I must thank my speechwriting colleagues from the European Speechwriter Network who helped me break into the profession when I was a recent graduate and taught me most of what I know." So thank you so much to everyone who I've learnt from over the past 12 years. And coming back again this year, I'm still learning so much from all of you, and I'm incredibly grateful to be here, and I'm incredibly grateful to talk about my book. This book came into existence because, as you know, I'm obsessed with rhetoric, but I'm also a very silly person, and I like finding rhetoric in silly examples. But I always caveat it with, but rhetoric is really dangerous, and we have to watch out for it. And Martin from Canterbury Press said to me, "You keep telling us that rhetoric is dangerous. Prove it. Write a book." So I did. And what the book is to me, it's a bit like a portal, like the TARDIS. We travel to different parts of the world throughout different geographic spaces, different times, to speakers of different religions, different ethnicities, different cultures, different genders. And one of the things that's most fascinating is it doesn't matter where you go, it doesn't matter the time period, the language, the most villainous people of that age, the tyrants and the dictators, all say variations of exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. And when we're living in an age where we believe that rhetorical discourse is disintegrating, I found that researching for this book was particularly important. I'm going to start off with, for Matthew Collins, with a bit of Shakespeare. Bear with me. I'm going to tell you about the play The History of Julius Caesar, which came out in 1599. Mark Antony is standing there by the slain corpse of Julius Caesar, and he gives this incredibly passionate speech that takes his audience on a whirlwind of emotions, and it lights in them this burning sense of injustice. They're angry, they want something to happen, and at the very closing of his speech, he has this very powerful metaphor that invokes the power of nature and tells his audience to go to war. He says, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war." That's his way of saying, you can imagine someone holding the vicious dogs. He's saying, let them go. Let's cause this chaos. Let's cause this damage. And it's very powerful. If you travel forward in time, and this is a real example, and you go to Germany in the Second World War and you listen to Joseph Goebbels' Totalen Krieg speech, it's an hour and 54 minutes long. Germany had just lost the Battle of Stalingrad. The German morale was on the floor. People were depressed. It's the first time they realized they're properly going to lose this war. And in 1 hour and 54 minutes, Goebbels managed to reinvigorate the entire nation with this momentous speech that he gave, the Total War speech. And he took his audience on this emotional journey. And if you read the transcript, it says, the minister cannot be heard because of the applause. The minister cannot be heard because of the applause. And he really riles his audience up. And his closing sentence was an imperative, invoking the power of nature through a metaphor. He said, "Now people, rise up and let the storm break loose." It's no coincidence that Goebbels, one of the most notorious Nazi speakers, used exactly the same closing for his speech that William Shakespeare did when he was writing Julius Caesar and wrote Mark Antony's speech, because there is a pattern that villainous people use in order to manipulate and distort their audiences. I often ask people, what would it take for a speaker to convince you to die for an ideology? You probably think, that will never happen to me. I'd never do that. But the answer is, history is filled with people like you who said you would never die for an ideology, yet one speaker in the right context with the right setting has made them want to die for that ideology. And I think that's terrifying. We've been speaking a lot about demagogues. And yes, history is filled with them. And one of the best ones, and this links to one of the speakers we were looking at yesterday, about invoking time, invoking momentousness. This speaker was Mussolini. Think about this opening and how he managed to get away with it. He said, "Black shirts of the revolution, men and women of all Italy, Italians all over the world, beyond the mountains, beyond the sea, listen." that level of authority. And he was about to tell them that Italy was going to war. He said, a solemn hour, and this is where it links into the speech from yesterday from Kevin Toulis, a solemn hour is about to strike in the history of the country. 20 million Italians are at this moment gathered in the squares of all Italy. It is the greatest demonstration that human history records. 20 million, one heart alone, one will alone, one decision. It's absolutely terrifying to look at what he did and how he managed to manipulate the Italian people, and then look at how exactly the same over-the-top, hyperbolic invoking of kairos, of time, is happening today in a lot of our political speakers. I'm now going to take you somewhere slightly a bit weirder. We're going to transport to the Tang dynasty in China. So it's about, let's say, 690 AD. There was a young lady called Wu Zetian who was a concubine to the emperor. The emperor had about, I think, 70 concubines and 12 wives, and she managed to eventually work her way to the top. She managed to have the empress brutally murdered and took her place, and was the empress of China. But it didn't stop there. When her husband died and her son took over, she usurped her son and became the emperor. The emperor. She transcended the entire patriarchal structures of the Tang dynasty of China in the era. She even transcended Middle Chinese grammar because they referred to her in the masculine because they didn't know what to call her. And it was very hard for me to find examples of her speeches, but I found some. But one of the things that I want to draw your attention to was this polemic speech that was given against her by 3 rebels. They didn't like her. They didn't like having a female emperor. And they tried to raise an army, and they went around and they gave speeches. And one of them, called Lu Binwag, said, "The woman Wu has falsely usurped the throne. She has brought disorder to the palace. With a heart like a serpent and a nature like a wolf, she favors evil flatterers whilst destroying her good and loyal officials." And it's a very powerful polemic. It also accused her of incest, of infanticide, of many, many horrible things. And the history book, the Book of Tang, tells us that Wu was in her palace and her advisor said, "A polemic has been issued against you, this horrible speech." And she wanted to hear it. So they read it out to her. And I'm not joking when this is literally the translation. She listened to it and she thought, and she said, "Who is this man's speechwriter? He should be working for me." And then she went and she crushed this rebellion. She crushed them, and all 3 of the main rebel leaders were crushed. And then she went to her council, which is obviously all men, and she said to her council, "These were 3 brave men that I have had to kill." And she looked round at her council and said, "Are there any other brave men in the room?" And they were all silent. No one dared look up. Because we're in Exeter, which is obviously Exeter College, which is home to Tolkien, I've got a Lord of the Rings example here. You may all know that scene where they have the Fellowship of the Ring, they're forming it, and then Aragorn says, "You have my sword," and Legolas says, "And my bow," and Gimli says, "And my axe." And it's actually a very epic and powerful moment, but I tell you, it has nothing on 12th century Mongolia. So, there was a young man named Temujin, who was not particularly important. His father was a chieftain but died when he was young, but he had lots of powerful friends. He was held hostage by this opponent tribe called the Udwit Merkits. They kidnapped him and his wife Borta, and he was tied up. He managed to get loose his bonds and escape, and he went to his friends, these warlords, these chieftains, and he said, "They've dishonored me. They still have my wife hostage. Who is going to help me?" And one by one in this yurt, his friends each stood up, took a step forward, and gave a speech about how he had their support. And this one guy, Jamuka, was just like a little bit extra and over the top. But I thought I'd let you hear it, because we think about the sort of like how fantasy books create these speeches. This is the real thing. Jamuka said, "I have made offerings to the long spear-tip banner. I have beaten the cowhide drum that sounds with a deep rumble. I have ridden on my swift grey horse to be here. I have put on my leather-thonged armour. I have grasped my hilted sword. I have notched my arrow against my bow. Let us battle the Udwit Merkits to the death." And then Temujin and his friends all went and unleashed the full Mongol hell experience, and they rescued Borta, and the history books tell us that of the Udwit Merkits, not even their ashes survived. But again, think about like the rhetoric at play there, and think about the emotions that are going on there. Now, ethos is incredibly important for demagogues, and one of the people I was researching, who was probably the biggest demagogue, was Joseph Desiré Mobutu. So Mobutu wanted to be worshipped like a god. He didn't like the fact that Congo was called Congo because it was French. So he wanted to rename the whole country. So he had the power to rename the country to Zaire, which ironically is of Portuguese origin, but let's ignore that. But then he decided that his own name, Joseph Desiree, was not African enough. So he renamed himself to Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Nbendu Wazabanga, which translates to, think about ethos, Mobutu, the warrior who knows no defeat because of his endurance and inflexible will, and is all-powerful, leaving fire in the wakes as he goes from conquest to conquest. That was literally his name. And people had to call him this. And every time you watched the news, it would start with a picture of the clouds. And in the background, there'd be this faint picture that would come forwards, and it was Mobutu's face. So we like to talk about demagogues. He was a demagogue. Every single day, in every school in Zaire, children would spend the first 15 minutes running around the playground chanting these words. One party, one country, one father, Mobutu, Mobutu. One party, one country, one father, Mobutu, Mobutu. The rhetoric, the repetition, the indoctrination that he managed to achieve was terrifying. And I'm going to take you, if I've got time, Lucy, to one final speaker. And actually, this is Eva Peron. Eva Peron, who is perhaps one of the most powerful speakers, I think, to have ever spoken, and one of the most powerful demagogues, because she wanted to be loved, she wanted to be adored. And all of her speeches, most of her speeches are her expressing her love for the people, her love for Argentina, and her love for Juan Perón. And when she's giving this particular speech, she had just been diagnosed with cancer, and she was ill, and people could see that she was ill. They could see that she was unwell, and she finally admitted that she had cancer. And she gave this speech, and she said, "My doctors have told me not to be here. They've told me that I could die if I exert myself by being here. But it's worth dying to be here and to speak to you and to speak to the people of Argentina." And she talks about how her life is turning into shreds and she's leaving them behind, but how she hopes that the people of Argentina will pick up those shreds, hold them as a banner as they march on to victory. But a victory against who? Argentina wasn't at war. There was no enemy. She told them that there's an enemy hidden amongst you, hidden behind a smile or an extended hand. And she said, and I think this is one of the most powerful uses of chiasmus, no offense to JFK, but that was rubbish compared to what Eva Peron had, which is this repetition. So they knew that she was dying, and they knew that she was risking her life by being there. And she said, "The enemies of the people of Peron and of the fatherland have long known that Peron and Eva Peron are ready to die for this people. Now they know that this people are ready to die for Peron." And they started cheering. And you think, here's a country that's not at war, yet they're cheering about wanting to die for their political leader. And she went on to say, "Compañeros," which is like comrades, "I ask just one thing of you today, that all of us publicly vow to defend Peron and to fight to him until death, and that our oath will be shouted for a minute so that our cry can reach the last corner of the earth." And at this point, she turned around and put her hands in the air and she said, "Our lives for Peron." And her audience, they copied her, they put that, "Our lives for Peron." And I asked myself, what would it take to get a modern audience to chant about wanting to give their lives, not even for their country, but for a political leader? It's absolutely terrifying. And obviously these are all very extreme examples, but as the modern political discourse is shifting, we're finding more and more of these features coming into our everyday life. And one of the things that I was very lucky to is I got an endorsement from Terry Suplatz, and I'm going to read it to you, because obviously you won't trust my word. Why would you? I'm biased. And Terry Suplatz used to write, he was the senior speechwriter for Barack Obama. He said, "At a time when so many leaders around the world are stoking fear and hate, Guy Doza's brilliant. The language of evil is the handbook that humanity needs right now, not simply to understand the dangerous rhetoric of demagogues, but how to resist it." So in writing this, it's not only a historical exploration, it's a reflection on modern society, it's a reflection on modern rhetoric, it's a reflection on ourselves. And if anyone has as much fun reading it as I did writing it, you're going to have a great time, because researching this was absolutely fantastic. And I'm very, very grateful that Martin has come along and he's bought copies of the book. And by the way, it's not out until April the 24th. So this is your chance to get it. And he says that he's got a meeting in London in the afternoon, so he's going to be here for the break. So if you want a copy, you can go and chase that man over there in the purple shirt. And he'll be here for the break. And that's it. Thank you so much.